Let's take a look at the study questions for reading 25, the excerpt from Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Number one, Wilde says, but this is not a solution. It is an aggravation of the difficulty. Explain what he's talking about. He's talking about charity. And generally speaking, he's talking about people who um, try to help the poor, people who are being crushed by poverty, people who are being deprived of the necessities of life, people who are being crushed by um, unemployment and low wages and bad housing and poor food. He's talking about the kind of good that people try to do for each other. We should acknowledge that. But what he's saying is not a solution. He's going farther and saying it's an aggravation of the difficulty. Um, Certainly, if we think about poverty and class oppression as being a systemic thing in capitalism, and he's entirely right about the first one, but this is not a solution. It's not. It is trying to remedy the immediate suffering that people have. Now, to go farther and say that it is an aggravation of the difficulty, I don't know about that. Does it actually make things worse? That's what he's claiming. I don't know if he's making things worse. If you're making things worse by trying to help people who are living lives of deprivation, um, maybe because it's an aggravation because it helps to perpetuate an unjust system by making us feel better about it or by temporarily alleviating the um, despair and suffering and therefore anger of the people who are oppressed. So I don't know. He's definitely talking about charity. Number two, explain the importance of individualism in Wilde's advocacy of socialism. It's the whole point of his socialism, I think. I think that he believes that capitalist society prevents almost everybody from becoming a true individual. So that a form of society that would actually promote people realizing their individual selves would be much better. And the whole reason to advocate for socialism. Now, his reasons, maybe we can leave that to a further question. But the whole point is individualism. It's socialism for the sake of people becoming true individuals. Number three, Wilde writes, amongst them there is no grace of manner or charm of speech or civilization or culture or refinement and pleasures or joy of life. Who is he talking about? Well, yes, he's talking about the poor. And do you agree with what he says of them? Why or why not? I think that we naturally resist that kind of thing. It sounds like a put down of people. But yes, Wilde was a highly educated person, a highly refined person in the arts and intellectual matters, and had the privilege of having a very good education in Ireland and in England, and had a notion of what it meant to really enjoy life. To really enjoy life was to be able to develop yourself through education and to appreciate the great cultural and I suppose scientific achievements of humankind. And if you have no education and if you are crushed by having to work, imagine, England in the 19th century, you have to work ridiculous hours at very demanding labor, you're just not going to have a chance to develop yourself, develop your appreciation of these things. And to his mind, just taking away all joy. Now, that may be extreme. I think it is extreme, and I think most of us would say that. We have no reason to necessarily agree with Wilde, but maybe it helps to have some sense of where he's coming from. Number four, Wilde writes, they should be seated at the board and are beginning to know it. Who is they? Again, the poor. The previous line talks about how the poor are no longer satisfied with getting the crumbs off the table of the rich, really basically the bourgeoisie, the aristocrats. A rising social consciousness amongst ordinary people, at least in his society, that they are victims of an injustice, and well, who knows what will follow from that. Number five, Wilde says of socialism that under the new conditions, individualism will be far freer, far finer, and more intensified than it is now. Why does he believe this? He believes that property is the culprit, And his socialism, like Marx's socialism, is pretty much focused on one thing, and that's the elimination of private property. If you read more of the Communist Manifesto, that's what Marx and Engels say, that the program of the Communist Party can be boiled down to one imperative: get rid of private property, because then everything falls, right? If you do that, everything else that they consider to be oppressive and unjust about capitalist society, it all depends upon the institution of private property. So Wilde thinks that private property not only crushes most people by forcing them to live lives of thankless labor, but it even ruins the people who have property. It ruins the whole culture because, as he says, in our culture, we think what's important is to have, when he says what's most important is to be. And so that general acquisitiveness, that general concentration on acquiring wealth for its own sake, rather than developing yourself as a person, keeps almost everyone back. Number 6, what is the last line of this reading? Do you think Wilde is right? Do you think that in his proposed socialist society, things would be any different? Why or why not? The last part of the reading is that most people simply exist. That is all. Most people simply exist. That is, they exist, and they just sort of keep on existing, and there's very little meaning or aspiration towards something beyond themselves in their lives. That's what education is. I mean, I hope that you have some sense of that. That education is about reaching for something more than you already are. It's about, to a certain degree, self-improvement. And most people are denied that, or deny themselves that, even if they have the privilege of maybe doing something interesting or important with their lives. They're so inert that they don't do it. And, Wilde sees this as the great tragedy. We shouldn't just exist for the sake of existing. We should exist for the sake of for something that we want to be or do. Finally, number 7, Wilde writes, disobedience in the eyes of anyone who has read history is man's original virtue. Why do you agree with him? Well, I mean, he's saying, the context is really his contempt for poor people who just take it, who take the injustice, who don't stand up for themselves, who have accepted their lower status in society, the limitations that have been forced upon them, without a cry of protest. And what he's saying is that anybody who rebels in that situation is to be admired. Anyone who doesn't take it, anyone who refuses to play the game, or to accept their inferior status or role in the game, that he thinks is very admirable. To be disobedient, to be rebellious. Can't help mention the fact he is Irish, right? So that consciousness of being oppressed for a very long time by a colonizer is probably deeply rooted in his character. That rebellion, as opposed to obedience, is a virtue. Obedience and just taking it is not. I mean, that's what he says.